I knew it was over when Mark Elwin clicked his pen, smiled at legal, and said, "We'll just terminate her contract and outsource the rest." Like I was a spreadsheet error. I watched from behind the smoked glass of the boardroom door as he pitched the execs on a bold new future built without the people who'd actually built the past. My name was on every architecture diagram in that binder he flipped through like a takeout menu. I'd written the framework that kept Lurion's back-end stable through 4 mergers, 2 data migrations, and 1 very quiet IP infringement settlement that Mark didn't even know happened. But to him, I was legacy. Debris, something to flush out. When they called me in the next day, HR had the papers ready. He didn't even look up from his phone. "You've done good work," he said flatly, like I was being put out to pasture. "But we're streamlining. You understand?" I didn't nod. I didn't blink. I just asked, "Do you have the notarized IP transition form?" He finally glanced up. "What?" I pointed to the bottom of page 6 in my contract, laminated and tabbed in my folder. "You'll want to read clause 14.3d before I sign anything. By the way, if you're watching this and you're one of the 97% who haven't subscribed yet, it helps us more than you know. 1 click, and you help keep stories like this alive. Throw us a like too. It keeps the lights on and the fine print sharp." They didn't read it. Not really. They thought they had everything. My badge, my title, my team. What they didn't have and never bothered to ask about was the licensing trail. 7 years ago, I'd filed a quiet side letter through my personal LLC, Bellwright IP Holdings, assigning all derivative work rights back to myself unless a separate, notarized agreement was executed at separation. It was standard legalese for most freelance engineers. But I wasn't freelance, I was internal, which made it deeply non-standard and very, very binding. Still, I signed the termination form without protest, collected my umbrella, smiled at the HR manager like we were old classmates. Mark looked bored. "We'll forward you your final check," he said, already halfway out the door. I stopped him just long enough to say, "Keep an eye on the compliance logs." He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" I just said, "Because you're about to learn what happens when you delete the architect without reading the blueprint." The first issue hit Monday. Minor. A misfire in the customer license verification script. By Tuesday, the Asia Pac data mirror failed a checksum. On Wednesday, their third-party analytics vendor flagged corrupted API output. But Mark didn't flinch. He told the team to push through. His favorite phrase was, "Move fast, fix later." He didn't notice that every patch they applied made things worse, because the system wasn't failing randomly. It was failing methodically, precisely, on a timer. You see, the architecture I built wasn't just code. It was a language, a locked sequence of logic paths and rotating security tokens embedded at the kernel level. Without a full schema key, which I held, the system would slowly invalidate itself, not catastrophically, just inconveniently, just enough to break trust, disrupt partners, erode SLA uptime until regulatory compliance failed, which is exactly what started happening by the end of week 2. Meanwhile, Bellwright IP Holdings quietly submitted 3 notices, 1 to the USPTO, 1 to the Federal Software Licensing Registry, and 1 to the Lurion Board's General Counsel, CC'd confidentially, of course. Subject line: Derivative Work Rights and Retained License Authority. It was only 4 pages. Not dramatic, not threatening, just factual, boring even. Unless you understood the implications. Because what Mark never realized, and what legal had somehow missed, was that none of the platform's core logic had ever been reassigned. It was all mine. And they'd fired me without securing a transition, which meant the contract they waved like a victory flag, it was missing the one clause that mattered, the clause that reverted everything, every module, every system, every line of logic, back to me. By default. No need for a fight, no need for a gavel, just time. And time, as it turned out, was no longer on their side. Mark treated product architecture the same way a frat guy treats a moving checklist. Toss everything in a trash bag, call it efficiency, and pretend the valuables weren't buried in the mess. Within a month, he'd replaced nearly every in-house tool with shiny off-the-shelf platforms slapped together by contractors who didn't understand half the use cases they were replicating. Anything that looked modular or legacy was out. Anything with a sleek onboarding page and a marketing budget was in. He called it modernization. I called it gutting the brainstem and wiring up a mood ring. I tried, once, to speak up during the product strategy review. Just flagged a couple transition gaps. Some small integration inconsistencies with our external SLA protocols. And, more importantly, a quiet little clause in our vendor escrow agreements that could trigger an automatic revocation if non-original modules replaced critical infrastructure without a verified license trace. He didn't even let me finish. "You always obsess over the fine print," he said, grinning like I'd asked to borrow his yacht. "Relax, we've got legal for that." The room chuckled. His new chief of ops, a guy named Darren who used to sell crypto payroll software, made a crack about engineers not understanding how real business works. I let it pass. Mark slid my old compliance binder across the table to the legal team. "Just review the transition language. We'll be fine." They nodded. They skimmed. Not one of them flipped to the subcontractor annex. See, what none of them understood was that the systems I built weren't just engineered. They were licensed. Not in the flashy public way, in the quiet, deeply structured way that linked every critical subsystem to a core IP vault. That vault was bound by a recursive clause, 14.3d, which essentially said, in absence of formal transfer at point of role termination, ownership reverts to the original creator and any designated holding entity. It was buried under pages of routing logic, contractor fallback terms, and non-standard asset mapping language. Nobody ever read that far, except me. Mark's confidence was performative. He wasn't just trying to fix the company. He was trying to make a name for himself. That meant fast wins, media buzz, investor flash. He didn't understand what we'd actually built over the last decade, how delicate the integrations were, how custom the logic had become, how many of the vendor contracts were piggybacking off our architecture without knowing it, or how many regulatory frameworks we'd hard-coded into the back end. His vision was all color palettes and speed. Mine had always been about function and control. Still, I let it all go. I watched as they replaced our adaptive load balancer with some third-party API middleware that had exactly zero redundancy protocols. I listened as the new dev lead explained loudly that we'd over-engineered ourselves into stagnation. They had no idea what they were poking at. They didn't know which systems were interdependent or how removing one would fracture 5 others. But I did. At night, I monitored the public repositories they used. I saw the commits from the offshore teams, sloppy, rushed, full of copy-pasted wrappers with no contextual error handling. I saw my name stripped from old framework files and replaced with acronyms that meant nothing. But the system didn't care whose name was on the file. The system only responded to who held the key, and that key still belonged to me. The first real sign of trouble came on a Thursday. Their analytics partner emailed a warning. Your request volumes are exceeding quota due to malformed calls. Please confirm system integrity. Mark brushed it off. That's their problem. 2 hours later, the vendor escalated. We are suspending traffic from your IP block until validation protocols are corrected. That wasn't a blip. That was the start of decay. I sent no warnings, no follow-ups, no gloating messages. Just quietly updated my own logs and watched as more pieces began slipping. He thought I was gone, that I'd been outmaneuvered, that his contract, skimmed and unchecked, gave him victory. He didn't realize he'd signed a blueprint with a fuse. The room they chose wasn't even a proper office, just one of those generic beige-lit conference rooms with a dying spider plant and a crusty box of tissues in the corner. Mark sat at the head of the table like a game show host, pretending he had good news. Next to him was Sheila from HR, fingers hovering over a printout like she expected me to cry. I didn't. I'd seen this coming a month ago when they asked me to document my workflows more thoroughly and strip out admin-level credentials I'd held for nearly a decade. They thought I'd roll over like everyone else, like the back-end guy they fired in February who left in silence while the payment stack unraveled. Mark didn't waste time. We're streamlining roles, he said, leaning back like a man who thought streamlining made him sound strategic instead of spineless. Effective immediately. You're released. It's not performance-based, just structural. His tone made it clear he expected me to thank him for the clarity. I didn't flinch, didn't frown, just unpinned my badge, set it on the table, and stood slowly. Then I'll need a signed IP transition form, I said, voice even. I didn't raise it. Didn't let emotion leak in, just those 10 words. Mark's smile wobbled like a loose tooth. What? He asked, a half laugh under his breath, like he wasn't sure if he'd heard me right or if I was trying to be cute on the way out. I reached into my folder, same one I'd brought to every sprint planning, every executive check-in, every audit dry run, and slid out a laminated copy of my original contract. I'd highlighted the clause in yellow and marked it with a red sticky tab labeled Required on Exit. Page 16, I said, tapping it gently. Clause 14.3d. You'll want to read it. Sheila blinked first. Her eyes skimmed the paragraph and then darted to Mark. He leaned forward, scanning the lines with that tight-jawed squint people get when they realize they just stepped into a problem they don't understand. He looked like someone trying to read a recipe in a language he never learned but insisted he spoke fluently. "What is this?" he asked. "It's the clause that governs the transfer of derivative intellectual property developed during my tenure," I said calmly. "It states that unless a notarized transition agreement is executed at separation, all IP defaults to the creator, me. And since I filed the underlying framework through Bellwright Holdings, any transfer would also need to be co-signed by our legal rep, which I assure you hasn't happened." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then turned to Sheila like she might bail him out. She was already scrolling her emails on her phone, tapping out a message to legal, I assume. I waited. "I don't think we need to get dramatic," Mark finally said, but the confident tone was gone. It was all muscle memory now. Buzzwords he used like pepper spray to ward off real accountability. "We've already onboarded the new infrastructure, which is still running on the legacy core I authored, I cut in, patched over with integration wrappers. But without licensed continuity keys, those systems will begin failing. Some already have." I shrugged. No drama, just process. He looked like he wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. Because deep down, he knew, or at least he felt it, that crawling sense that something was already broken, and this was the moment it all started making sense. "Of course. You're welcome to dispute the clause," I added. "That'll initiate a review. You'll need to submit a detailed technical breakdown of the source dependencies, logic forks, and IP chain of custody, which I'd be happy to respond to, with receipts." Mark didn't respond. He just nodded, barely perceptible, like a man nodding to a wave that was already crashing over him. Sheila finally spoke. We'll follow up with legal." I smiled. Not because I was gloating, but because the silence told me everything. They thought this was a routine firing. They thought I'd walk out, fade into the past, and leave my life's work behind like a coffee mug and a goodbye email. They had no idea the trap they'd just sprung. Not a malicious trap, just a contractual one, just fine print, just something they never bothered to read. I left without looking back. Didn't ask for a box. Didn't want the company hoodie or the farewell lunch. I had everything I needed. In code, in filings, in time-stamped logs and registered clauses. And as I stepped into the elevator, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt surgical, like something precise had finally been executed. And soon, they'd start to feel it too. Not in a loud, fiery collapse, but in quiet errors, missed data, failing authentications, systems that forgot how to function without the one person who built their memory. It started with a notification from the logistics dashboard, timestamp errors across 5 regions. Nothing dramatic, just a hiccup, as Mark called it. "Someone forgot to update the time zone table," he said, half laughing in the Monday morning stand-up. No biggie. He didn't know that the time zone table wasn't standalone. It was a cascading sync point linked to the master data flow map. One misfire there, and every event-driven process began accumulating micro delays. It didn't crash. That would have been merciful. "No," it stuttered. Quietly, constantly. By noon, customer data reports began mismatching across platforms. The product team blamed a recent patch. Engineering blamed the outsourced dev team in Krakow. The Krakow team insisted they'd followed the new migration spec. And they had. Except the spec relied on architecture that no longer had active schema validation because, well, the licensing beacon tied to my original framework had expired, exactly 48 hours after my termination, per its design. They still hadn't read Clause 14.3d. Mark called it a little turbulence. He told stakeholders it was expected during innovation. Then the billing API failed to reconcile with the internal accounting ledger. Clients got invoices for services they hadn't used and credits for things they hadn't bought. Finance flagged it within minutes. Engineering couldn't reproduce it. Legal started to get nervous, but still assumed it was just sloppy migration. They hadn't connected the dots. Not yet. But I had. Because the dots weren't meant to be seen. They were meant to be felt. The offshore team filed 3 back-to-back JIRA tickets labeled critical, each one more frantic than the last. Data loss risk if backup pipeline doesn't revalidate. Auth keys not responding to root certificate override. Fallback dependencies corrupted, cannot restore without full diagram access. Access they no longer had. Mark didn't respond directly. He delegated it to Ops and scheduled a resilience review for the following Thursday. "Let's not overreact," he said. "Things always shake a little when we scale up." He was still riding high on that LinkedIn post he'd made last week. Transitioning to a leaner, smarter future, streamlined architecture for a modern world, got over 400 likes. He probably refreshed it during the meeting while finance quietly panicked about unbalanced ledgers and corrupted fiscal entries. The vendor integrations started timing out. At first, just 2, then 6. Then 14. Our e-commerce partner in Singapore emailed, then called. "Your systems are failing security handshake. Did you rotate your keys without notice?" Mark didn't even know what they were referring to. He looped in legal, they looped in compliance. Someone finally opened my contract again, this time not to wave around as a formality, but to actually read. They made it to clause 14.3d by Thursday morning. And that's when silence started to fail them. Because up until then, everyone had assumed the problem was temporary, an engineering oversight, maybe even a disgruntled dev botching the handoff. But Clause 14.3d didn't leave room for that interpretation. It spelled out, clearly, that in the absence of a signed notarized IP transition form, all derivative frameworks, libraries, routing logic, and security protocols reverted to the creator. And the creator, as filed with the Federal Software Licensing Registry, was Bellwright IP Holdings, which meant nothing they were using belonged to them. They scrambled. I know, because one of the senior platform engineers, Jenna, texted me that night. "They're freaking out. Nobody knows what's real and what's failing by design. Did you actually plan this?" I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to, but because it wasn't a plan. It was structure. The system was simply doing what it had been built to do, protect itself from unauthorized use, fail safely, erode without trust. Their infrastructure wasn't collapsing all at once. It was decaying, rotting from the inside out, the kind of failure that doesn't trigger alarms until it's too late. Clients started noticing. Downtime escalated. Their main partner in San Diego threatened breach of SLA. Marketing scrambled to issue a non-apology about unexpected third-party complications. But the third party wasn't to blame. Their own negligence was. Mark kept up the act. He smiled in meetings, talked about accelerating transition timelines and resilience adjustments. But his hands started twitching. He stopped taking off his blazer during calls, the way people do when their confidence is peeling but they haven't figured out who's watching yet. And legal? They were starting to watch. Because the silence that had protected them for weeks, the illusion that everything was fixable, was cracking. Clause 14.3d wasn't a glitch. It was law. It was enforceable. It was notarized, time-stamped, and tied to every system still operational enough to remind them. They'd let go of the architect without securing the blueprint. And now, silence wasn't going to save them. By the time legal understood what they were looking at, the server logs had already become a graveyard of silent rejections. Authentication tokens that used to renew automatically were now flagged as foreign. Integrations that once ran like clockwork were grinding down into error loops. And the vendor calls? They stopped being polite. One threatened litigation, another simply forwarded a termination clause. The offshore dev team stopped responding altogether after someone in Poland realized they'd overwritten protected logic with unsecured scripts and might have breached international compliance standards. And through it all, Mark just kept saying, "We'll get ahead of it." He didn't know they were already behind. The real unraveling didn't happen in engineering. It happened in a fourth-floor conference room where someone from legal finally decided to read my original employment agreement. Not skim, not summarize, read. They got to page 16, found clause 14.3d, and paused. Then someone flipped back to cross-reference the addenda. That's when they found it. A subcontractor appendix I'd authored myself, reviewed, and had notarized in duplicate. One copy for HR, one for Bellwright IP Holdings. It wasn't flashy, just 2 sentences. All derivative intellectual property reverts to creator unless explicitly reassigned via notarized transfer form. Licensing rights default to original creator's designated holding entity in absence of executed transition agreement. That was it. No flair, no traps, just fact. No one had ever filed a transfer form, not during onboarding, not during the streamlining, not during my exit, not even when Mark announced the new back-end rebuild and legal greenlit the migration. They never asked who held the license beneath it all. They assumed ownership meant access. They assumed my quiet didn't mean control. It did. The look on the general counsel's face, when she realized none of the platform's critical infrastructure was actually theirs, was described to me later by someone in the room. She aged 10 years in 3 minutes. They tried to recover fast, pulled the IP registry listings, found that Bellwright held not just the framework license, but also 3 secondary design patents and the logic blueprint for the system's multi-region fallback protocol. Patents they'd been using without clearance for almost 2 months. On production systems, in live client environments. And Bellwright had just filed notices with the Software Compliance Bureau flagging unauthorized use. That triggered an audit window, which triggered a suspension of regulatory clearance, which in turn voided 2 of their partner SLAs overnight. Finance called legal, legal called ops, ops called engineering, and finally, Mark called legal, full panic now, voice flat, asking the question he should have asked the day he fired me. What exactly does she own? The answer? Everything that matters. Not just the logic that processed inbound data, not just the modular API links, but the actual binding threads that kept all of it compliant. The heartbeat of the backend, the part of the codebase you didn't touch unless you had a death wish or a notarized clearance. Legal's internal memo summed it up in 12 words. We no longer have the legal right to operate our core architecture. There wasn't a single exec who understood what that meant, at first, but the finance lead figured it out. Fast. She asked the room, "What happens if clients find out?" Nobody had a good answer, because when clients find out you've been running critical systems on IP you don't own, systems that are now failing and can't legally be patched, what happens is they leave. And they were starting to. An insurance firm in Chicago suspended their renewal. A logistics provider in South Carolina demanded a compliance breakdown within 48 hours, or they'd file breach. Their European partner flat out stated, "We cannot legally maintain a relationship with a vendor using unlicensed IP." The board was briefed, quietly, in panic mode terms, not because they were liable yet, but because the question had already been asked, how did you not know she owned it? And there it was, the thing none of them could say out loud, that they'd been so eager to replace the legacy that they never bothered to check who actually was the legacy. They saw a quiet engineer, a ghost in the server room, someone too calm, too predictable, too unimportant to matter. But the contract didn't care what they saw. The license registry didn't care who had the title. And clause 14.3d, it was still there, plain as day. They didn't own the system. They'd just been borrowing it on my terms. The first expiration hit at 2:04 a.m. Eastern, a silent key rotation on the authentication bridge between their legacy reporting suite and the finance gateway. The offshore team thought it was a time zone error. They patched it. It failed again, then failed harder. By 7:30 a.m., the East Coast billing cycle froze. Mark told the product team to switch to the modernized pipeline, the one built on top of wrappers that depended entirely on my original license. That key expired an hour later. I wasn't there to see the Slack channels light up, but I could imagine it. Each channel urgent, finance endpoints down. Escalating, no response from failover. Does anyone have access to the legacy schemas? They didn't, because those weren't public. They were secured behind a Bellwright access layer keyed to a certificate that expired 21 days post-employment. Per the clause, no one had bothered to override, not by accident, by design. A logistics client in Nevada flagged failed authentications, then one in Ontario. Then their biggest enterprise client, a multi-billion-dollar fulfillment firm with strict uptime guarantees, filed a notice of termination. Breach of SLA, no refunds. The notice included a line that should have hit like a bullet. Repeated failure to secure licensed infrastructure represents willful noncompliance. That word, willful, turns a billing dispute into a legal liability, and someone in legal knew it. Because 10 minutes later, the regulatory board received a formal memo from Bellwright IP Holdings. Notice of reinstatement of exclusive intellectual property rights, per clause 14.3d, filed post-separation. It was surgical. No threats, no accusations, just a simple legal step declaring formally that Bellwright was reclaiming the intellectual property now being used in violation of the clause. The regulator stamped it as received. Time-stamped, validated, official. From that moment forward, any system still running on the architecture I built was operating in a gray zone at best and a direct violation at worst. They tried to find workarounds. Mark ordered a full override, new API keys, patched bridges, cut the legacy out, he barked. But every new integration depended on the same base logic. They'd built their Flash on a skeleton they didn't understand. Remove the bones and everything crumbled. The authentication servers began rejecting traffic on a rolling schedule, 12-hour intervals, pre-programmed, because the code was built to verify trust over time. No trust, no function. Someone from their infrastructure team, Greg, I think, reached out to Jenna, who used to work on my team before the restructuring. He asked if I'd be open to consulting to help them stabilize the platform during the transition. Jenna forwarded me the message, no commentary, just the subject line. Emergency stabilization support request. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The regulatory board's acknowledgement had already made it clear this wasn't a bug to fix. This was ownership reasserted. At headquarters, Mark tried to spin it. These are just temporary escalations, he said in an all-hands call, pacing in front of a wall of muted faces. We're taking back control. He didn't realize how little he had left. The procurement department quietly froze 2 upcoming renewals. Compliance flagged 8 vendors for review. 3 of them already filed formal notices citing improper IP use. That meant internal investigations. That meant loss of standing. That meant headlines. And I hadn't said a word. I wasn't on Twitter. I wasn't giving interviews. I wasn't even in the building. But my name was starting to come up in meetings, the kind held behind closed doors with no notes, no recordings, and no witnesses. Someone had finally pulled the full Bellwright registry and seen what else we held. Trademarks on the interface structure, patents on the fallback logic, and a pending filing on the predictive caching layer they'd already announced in beta. They hadn't just fired a lead engineer. They'd tried to cut out the spine and expected the limbs to keep moving. And now? Their systems were coughing up errors like lungs full of dust. Clients were leaving. Vendors were suspicious. Auditors were circling. And the board was asking one question. Did we know this was coming? They didn't. But I did. Because architecture isn't just about function. It's about timing, expiry, trust, and every route they had left was already counting down. Mark left the first voicemail at 6:11 p.m. His voice measured, borderline friendly, like he thought if he just acted casual enough, I'd forget everything that happened. Hey, we're running into a couple integration issues. Might be good to catch up. Nothing urgent. Call when you can. Classic. Mark. Make the emergency sound like brunch plans. I let it go to voicemail, then deleted it without listening to the rest. His second call came at 10:38 p.m., less composed. Look, I'm trying to keep this professional, but this, whatever this is, it's gone far enough. Gone far enough? He hadn't even seen the press release yet. The next morning, Synaxis, Lurin's oldest, fiercest competitor, published a quiet announcement on their website, introducing Polaris OS, a new standard in modular enterprise routing, built with resilience at its core. It didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. Just a single paragraph about stability, compliance, and speed, and a small note at the bottom, lead infrastructure consultant, Bellwright IP Holdings, with my name. It took 3 hours for someone at Lurin to forward the link to Mark. I imagine he stared at it for a while, maybe reread it 3 times, maybe checked the domain to make sure it wasn't fake. Then came the email to my lawyer, from Mark's assistant, dressed up in diplomacy, but beneath the thin layer of civility, you could smell the fear. Given recent developments, we'd like to revisit the terms of her separation. We believe there may be mutual benefit in exploring a limited license structure or advisory retainer to ensure system continuity during transition. My lawyer replied the same afternoon. 2 lines, no warmth. Our client has no further obligations. All proprietary elements remain under his ownership. Mark didn't call again, but the bleeding had already started. Polaris OS wasn't just a platform. It was everything Lurion had tried to cobble together without me, only it worked. And it worked because it was mine. The architecture they tried to replicate now stood whole, clean, bulletproof under the banner of their biggest competitor. Synaxis didn't gloat. They didn't need to. They just started onboarding clients, quietly, efficiently. Some of those clients used to belong to Lurion. Others had left recently, frustrated by outages, unexplained delays, and poor communication. The ones Mark said would bounce back. They didn't. Someone leaked internal emails from Lurion's ops team, panicked threads asking if Polaris OS was using stolen code, whether it matched known logic patterns, if legal recourse was possible. The answer to all 3? No, because the code was clean, the filings were solid, the IP was documented, and they'd signed away their right to question it the moment they terminated me without a transition agreement. Mark started losing meetings. Vendors postponed check-ins. Investors stopped replying. Someone from compliance told a former colleague of mine that Mark's name was now routinely omitted from client-facing decks. When the board asked for a timeline to full system recovery, he stalled. When they asked for an IP resolution strategy, he blinked. He'd fired the wrong person. Not just because I knew the systems, but because I was the systems. Every logic bridge, every fallback protocol, every compliance note embedded in the platform. That wasn't just work. That was authorship. And now that authorship had a new home. One that knew exactly how to move fast without falling apart. Word spread fast. Not through headlines or lawsuits, but through whispers in glass offices and Slack messages tagged eyes only. Heads of engineering started reaching out to Bellwright. Quiet inquiries, advisory interest. Do you have availability for system audits? Could we schedule a consultation on Polaris OS compatibility? I didn't respond to all of them, just the ones that used to take Mark's calls first. And as the requests came in, I thought back to that meeting room, the beige walls, the spider plant, the look on Mark's face when I asked for the IP transfer form. He thought the risk was losing one employee. He didn't realize the cost of underestimating the architect. Now, he watched the future take shape, exactly as he imagined it. Just not in his hands, not under his roof, not with his name, with mine. They booked the boardroom for executive session, legal briefing. No Zoom, no assistants. Phones placed face down in the hallway per protocol. What unfolded inside wasn't a discussion. It was a reckoning. Legal led with the slide nobody wanted to see. Current access status, IP critical systems. Next to each category, authentication layer, compliance router, predictive cache, redundancy logic, was the same word in bold red, unlicensed. The head of infrastructure tried to explain that the systems were still partially operational, but legal cut him off. Functioning is not the same as compliant. These systems are live in violation of federal software licensing regulations. Someone from finance stepped in, voice low, measured, almost apologetic. We have now lost 7 key accounts, 5 cited performance degradation, 2 flagged concerns around IP ownership. If Bellwright issues a cease use notification, that number will double by month's end. They didn't say it, but everyone in the room understood. This wasn't just erosion. This was controlled demolition, and they were standing in the dust cloud wondering when the ceiling would give. Then came the number. Estimated fallout, $48 million. Not hypothetical, not if we don't act soon, just estimated, like a death certificate waiting for a signature. The chairman leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands steepled with the kind of calm that only means trouble. Did you or did you not secure transition rights from the prior infrastructure lead before termination? Mark looked like a man choking on invisible smoke. We believed at the time that full ownership was implied under her employment terms, he said, trying to sound like he still had control of the room. There was a review process. Legal confirmed, legal skimmed. The general counsel interrupted, and they did so because the transition was rushed, based on your urgency. Mark turned red, then white. He tried again. She didn't raise any objections. She didn't have to, the chairman said, cutting through his sentence like a scalpel. She wrote the clause. Silence. Not tense, not angry, just absolute. The kind of stillness that comes when a room collectively realizes a mistake hasn't just been made. It's been activated. And there's no patch, no walk back, no PR fix. One board member flipped his binder shut and muttered, "This is what happens when you fire without reading." Mark sat back, hands flat against the table, the weight of every skipped clause, every smug dismissal, every ignored email landing on his shoulders like wet concrete. For the first time since he took the job, he didn't speak. The vote wasn't even dramatic, just procedural. The chairman slid a printed sheet across the table, a decision already made. No shouting, no argument, just the silent death rattle of authority. By the end of the hour, Mark's badge access was disabled. His laptop surrendered. A junior admin collected the framed leadership award from his office shelf without a word. He didn't say goodbye. Nobody offered him a chance, because this wasn't a resignation. It wasn't a scandal. It was a removal. Cold, clinical, and overdue. Outside the building, the sky was overcast. Not raining, just gray in that way that makes everything feel like consequence. A company car pulled up to the curb. He got in, alone. No one watched him leave, but everyone felt the absence. Later that evening, the internal memo went out. Effective immediately, Mark Elwin will be stepping down from his role as Interim Chief Systems Officer. We thank him for his service and leadership during a period of critical transition. No applause, no fond memories, just a footnote written in neutral tone, buried between updates about cafeteria hours and the Q4 sales target. But people noticed, because on the internal server, right above the memo, someone uploaded the archived IP clause presentation, the one Mark had refused to read during the migration project. Its file name? Clause 14 final.pptx. And beneath it, someone added a comment. Read it this time. It didn't make headlines at first, just a quiet update on the Bellwright IP Holdings registry page. A few clicks deep under Framework Licensing Activity, a single new entry appeared. All former integrations with Lurian Technologies terminated as of date. IP protected under Creator Retention Clause per Contract 14.3d. No bold lettering, no drama, just legal clarity in plain language. But that line didn't stay quiet for long. By noon, investors noticed, Lurian's valuation slipped 6%, by close of market, 22%. Analysts started whispering about unrecoverable architectural liabilities. The phrase, poor contract hygiene, showed up in 3 separate fund memos. One investor called it, the most expensive oversight I've seen since Enverix forgot to renew their AWS certs mid-acquisition. The board scrambled, again. Their interim systems officer tried to piece together a roadmap, but without licensed infrastructure, every plan was just a mirage. One venture partner pulled funding. Another issued a pause on disbursements pending IP clarity. Lurian's CTO resigned 3 days later. And me? I didn't say a word. No press statement. No LinkedIn post. Just a white paper, clean, methodical, 38 pages on modular compliance systems and retention logic. Titled simply, Architectural Continuity in Decentralized Frameworks, published through Bellwright. No commentary, just footnotes, code samples, and a section on the strategic value of IP clauses in long-term infrastructure builds. It made the rounds. Quietly. Compliance officers bookmarked it. Tech leads forwarded it. One GC wrote, "Mandatory reading before our next contract review." Another tweeted, "Whoever wrote this just buried a 48-mile cautionary tale beneath 10 pages of footnotes." I didn't reply. I just kept moving. Bellwright picked up 3 new consulting contracts that month. Not from revenge, not from exposure, just structure. Quiet, trusted structure. Because people remembered what happened when someone forgot to read the clause, when they underestimated the author, when they looked at a quiet builder and saw a cost center instead of a keystone. Lurion tried to pivot. They issued a rushed press release about platform evolution and strategic realignment. No one bought it. Clients were still leaving. Partners were still filing separation notices. Their legal team was still fielding calls asking, "How exactly did you miss that?" It didn't matter anymore. I never raised my voice. I never raised a hand. I just wrote the clause and let time do the rest.